Hello, everyone. I'm Elizabeth Evans, a long-time member of TESOL Italy, and I'd like to welcome you to this session of the 48th TESOL Annual Convention. Our speaker for this session is Michelle Worgan. Michelle is an educator and materials writer, specialising in primary English language teaching. With a career spanning more than 20 years, she's passionate about changing the way we teach young learners, and she runs her own teacher development courses for primary ELT teachers on her website. The title of her talk is Inspiring Inquiries, How to Design an Inquiry Project for Primary. The floor is yours, Michelle.
Thank you, Elizabeth. And thank you everyone for coming on this Friday evening, whether you're here live or you're watching the recording later on. Let me just share my screen. Throughout the session, if you do have any questions, feel free to pop them in the Q&A box, and I will have a look at them at the end and try to answer any questions. So Elizabeth has already given me a lovely introduction, but I also prepared a slide. As Elizabeth said, I am a materials writer, but I was a teacher for many, many years. And I also do some teacher training as well. And throughout my teaching career, I experimented with different approaches over the years. And I discovered that the most effective approaches particularly for diverse groups of students, were those where the learners were at the center. So today I'm going to talk about inquiry-based learning, which is a learner-centered approach, and we'll look at how it might work in the primary English classroom. During the talk, I'll be sharing some materials that I've designed in order to explain the process that I go through when I'm designing an inquiry. Now, I just noticed in the little intro there, the video that was on before Elizabeth introduced me, and two words popped up that were empowerment and agency. And I love these words. These are words that have a lot to do with what I'm going to talk about today. So I was really pleased to see those words. So the plan today is, first of all, to look at what inquiry-based learning is. I'm going to go through the inquiry process. I'm going to talk about how I design this inquiry process, the steps it involves. And then I'm going to talk a little bit about how we can move towards having more independence, more autonomy from the learners themselves. And finally, I'll share a few benefits of this type of approach. So, my first question might be a question that you have yourself, is what is inquiry-based learning? And I'd love to know if you have heard of this approach. Have you heard of it before? Let me know if you're in the room now in the chat. Just a quick yes or no is fine. But I'm going to explain anyway, so don't worry if it's completely new to you. So an inquiry is basically a kind of project that is built around a question on a real-world topic. And it's where students carry out some activities that help them find answers to this question. Now, I'm seeing a few yeses in the chat, so that's good. You already have some kind of an idea about inquiry-based learning. So this approach is sometimes used in mainstream education, in primary schools and secondary schools, particularly in subjects like science, where students need to find something out through research and experimentation. In ELT, it's usually a topic-based or a concept-based approach. But instead of deciding prior to the teaching what students will learn, instead of already having everything decided, you know, the language that they're going to teach, everything that the materials that you're going to use, instead of deciding all of this before, and instead of the teacher deciding it, with this type of approach, we can allow students to explore their own questions about the topic and kind of adapt the language that we teach and the materials that we use to their interests and related to their questions. So the inquiry itself, the project and the inquiry is centered around that natural curiosity that children have. So we want to work with their questions, things that they want to know, and we then develop this into something that they can learn English through. So as I said before, it's an approach with quite a lot of learner autonomy and independent learning, but it's also very structured and it always follows the same series of stages. And that's what we're going to look at next. So how does it work? Well, if you're already familiar with inquiry-based learning, you may have heard of like a 5-stage cycle. But I prefer to display things differently and use this process diagram, as I think it's more visual and easy to follow. So I'm going to go through this process very, very, very quickly, as in 1 minute, a 1 minute explanation, and then I'm going to show you some examples so you get a better picture of what it might look like. So the first stage is the wonder stage, and we start with something that we call a provocation. And this is, I know it sounds like something bad. It's not. It's something good. It's something that will spark curiosity and engage students in the topic. So it could be an image or a book or an object, anything that introduces the topic and gets students excited about the topic or sparks their interest in it. So I would normally start with this, and then I would introduce the essential question or driving question, which I'm going to talk about in a minute. But basically, this is a question which students will aim to have answered by the end of the inquiry. Then I might get students to develop their own questions, see what questions they have about the topic, what questions they want to find answers to. And then we plan the research stage. Students carry out their research and then they collate their learnings, everything they've learnt. This is the evidence stage. And then they create a product which they then share with the class and which answers the essential question. So that's a really quick 1 minute summary, but don't worry because we're going to look at some of these stages in a bit more detail in the rest of the talk. So as teachers, this is what we do. This is kind of like a summary of what we would do. As we saw in that diagram just now, we start with the question, the essential question, and this kickstarts and guides the inquiry process. It guides the whole of the inquiry process from beginning to the end. Then we'll need to design some activities to guide the inquiry, particularly if this is a new approach for us as teachers and for our students. We're going to have to design some tasks for them to do. We can't just let them do it by themselves. So here we can think about what students need to know in order to answer the essential question. And this will help us plan some activities that they can do. So remember that by the end of the inquiry, all students should have an answer to the question. It might not be all the same answer, but they will have an answer. During the inquiry process, we also need to give students opportunities to reflect on their learning, to think about what they've learned, what they still need to know, and think about what they can do to find out this information, and also to talk about it with others. And then we invite students to showcase their learning and share it with the others. It doesn't have to be in a whole class situation. It could be in groups as well. So that's a summary. So let's focus now on probably one of the trickiest aspects, which is the essential question, which is what an inquiry is all about. So this is a central question. it has a fairly wide focus normally, and this is important, it doesn't have one single answer. It's a question that could be explored in multiple ways. So let's look at some examples so you get an idea of what types of questions might work. This one here, what makes the perfect home? Yeah, you can see how this does not have a single answer. There are lots of ways of answering this question and lots of different aspects of what makes a home that we could explore. Or this one, this question, where does our food come from? This one may seem to be a bit more specific, but it depends on what kind of food you're thinking about. And we'll look at this one a bit more later on and see some of the types of activities that you could do. And how do mini beasts survive? This is another one. So these could be three common topics, right? From the Young Learner Classroom: the home, food, and animals. So you'll see how these questions are fairly broad and can be answered in different ways depending on what we ask students to investigate. So there are different angles we could take depending on the student's age and their level. But how can we get students to explore these questions? It's not easy, is it? What makes the perfect home? Well, they might think they have an answer, but it's going to be a very simple answer and a personal one. So we need to guide students to find more information, find other perspectives in order to find, a good answer to this question. So I think we need to break these questions down into more manageable areas with more concrete questions that students can explore. So I give my students sub-questions. And then, depending on how familiar my students are with the approach, I will ask them to come up with some questions of their own. So let's have a look at some possible sub-questions for the essential question, how do mini beasts survive? So have a look at these questions. I mean, I'll read them out just in case there are people watching the recording who are not able to read them. How many types of mini beasts can you find? Where do they live? What do they look like? What can they do? How do they behave? How do they adapt? How long do they live? What dangers are there in their lives? What do they need to survive? And how can we protect them? So these questions help structure the inquiry and get students thinking about what they need to know in order to answer the essential question. So you can see that these questions go from very simple, very specific questions to more open, complex questions nearer the bottom. You might not want to, well, you probably won't want to give your students all of these questions because there are a lot. So you'd want to choose the questions that are most suitable for your students, depending on their age, their developmental level, and their linguistic level. So say students have got their questions. You've given them maybe 3 or 4 questions or 5 questions to research, but how are they going to do this research? We can't just tell students to go and do some research because we're talking about primary aged learners. So younger learners need some scaffolding and support. You could do the research as a class, so you could do it all together. You could, on one computer, or you could bring in some books and you could do it as a whole class activity. That's one way of doing it, but it wouldn't be very learner-centered. Or you could plan some activities that will help students find answers to their questions, and activities that require them to look at different types of information and different sources of information. So we're going to look at some ideas for activities that students could do to help them find out how mini beasts survive. So the first activity is a simple scavenger hunt. So here I would have students make a list of mini beasts that they think they might find in a particular place. So you choose this place, maybe it's the schoolyard or a park or their garden if they have one, or just in the street, whatever. You choose a place and you have students make a list of mini beasts they think they might find there, and then they visit this place and they just make a tally. So they check them off or they count the number that they find. So you could do this as a class activity if you can take the children outside, or you could set it as a homework activity for them to do. So here they are basically just identifying mini beasts, and they're practicing that vocabulary. If this is new vocabulary for them, they'll be practicing writing it, and they'll be practicing when they then share the results. Another activity could be to do some kind of an observation. So maybe you could bring in a real mini beast. You'd have to check on your school's regulations to see whether this is actually allowed. Or you could use toys or models. There are some quite realistic toy mini beasts. And you could have students observe them, examine them, they could measure them, they could draw a picture and label it, they could make a model. This is something I always remember from when I was at school a long time ago. Our teacher brought in some live slugs, and each group had a slug in the middle of the table, and we had to make a model from clay of the slug, and we had to observe it and make a model. And I really remember this vividly nearly 40 years later. So this type of activity can be really memorable. Then there's the traditional online search, which is probably what we think about when we think about research. No, I'll go online and see what I can find. You could do this as a class or get students to do it in groups, and maybe you could have each group search for information about a different mini beast. You could also use documentaries, wildlife documentaries. There are lots of clips on YouTube that you could use of mini beasts in nature. So I would here ask my students to notice as much as they can about maybe the physical attributes of the mini beast, its behavior, how it moves, what predators it has, and things like that. You could also focus on the life cycle, because obviously that's related to the survival of mini beasts. And this activity, the last one here, is an art activity. And I like this activity because it's you're having learners compare a real mini beast or a realistic diagram or picture with one that's not so realistic, that could come from fiction, for example, picture books or a cartoon, and having them compare it is quite a nice activity to do. Maybe doesn't really help them answer the essential question, but it could help them if later they're preparing some visual materials in their product that they're creating. Another idea that I haven't added to the slide is to interview an expert on mini beasts, for example, an entomologist or somebody from a local wildlife protection organization. Or you could invite your science teacher. If you work in a school, your science teacher could be a great person to invite into your classroom to do a Q&A. I think it's really nice to involve teachers from other subjects, and you could develop a cross-curricular inquiry, for example. So you would do maybe 2 or 3 activities. You wouldn't want to do all of them, I don't think. And now students have some information, right? They've learned something from these activities. And some of this information might help them answer the essential question. So they need to look at this information, see how it answers the question, what evidence they have to back up their answers to the essential question. So we've done probably the main part of the inquiry now. Yeah, we've had our questions, we've done activities to find out information, we've looked at the information and thought about how it answers the question. So now we need to create the product. So the product is something that students create. They'll probably do this in groups, that demonstrates their answers to the essential question. So students can choose to demonstrate their learning in different ways. And for me, offering students choice in this is really important. So maybe students could make a poster or a mini book or a lap book, or they could make a video or do some kind of a performance, or they could give a demonstration. It would really depend on the topic. You can choose the types of products that you think might work well with your topic, but having some variety, I think, allows for this difference and diversity among your students. So that is how I would do an inquiry. So let's look at the design process. Well, let's summary of this design process of how I go about it. The first thing that I do, or you will do if you want to design your own inquiry, is to choose your topic. And how you choose will depend on how you work and your context. So perhaps you follow a syllabus or you use a course book. And in that case, your topic is probably already chosen for you. But you'll need to find a way to match that with your students' interests. Think about what might interest your students about the topic, or find an interesting way of looking at it. Alternatively, you could choose your own topic, things that you know your students are interested in, or even better, choose the topic together with your students, involve them in this decision making. Once you have your topic, you need to formulate an essential question, which is probably the hardest part. When you have your essential question, then you can think about the language that students might need during the inquiry. So what vocabulary and what structures will they need to be able to answer the question or explore different areas, sub-areas of that topic, and also to understand the materials that you are going to provide them with. So you can predict this language to some extent, but I also think it's nice to leave things flexible, because there will be some emergent language coming from the students. And I think it's a really nice idea to leave space for this emergent language. So you've got some language objectives, some vocabularies, so maybe a grammar point or two. Maybe you also think about how you can recycle language that students have already covered beforehand. But there might be some other learning objectives that you'd like students to meet. So thinking about the resources that you bring in, whether these are reading materials or videos, think about what skills students might need. For example, sub-skills such as skimming and scanning for reading and identifying the main ideas. And then also other objectives, things like pronunciation. Again, pronunciation, I think it's nice to focus on things that come up when you're teaching some of the new vocabulary. And also competencies and future skills, you could also add those into your objectives. Once you have your objectives, you can start to think about the activities that you might plan. Remember, these activities need to help students answer the essential question and meet the objectives that you've already outlined. So here you can see my food resource pack. And in this one, we explore the question, where does food come from? And I decided to have my students focus on pizza because they all love pizza. Who doesn't? Well, actually, when I was a child, I didn't like pizza because I didn't like tomato, but don't tell anyone. And I love pizza now. So we were thinking about pizza, and the first thing I might have them do is to identify the ingredients of a pizza. So they can find a recipe and think about what ingredients they need and then where these ingredients come from. So obviously, you know, tomatoes, cheese, flour for the dough. Couldn't remember the word in English then. But also other toppings and things that they might want to put on their favorite pizza, for example. So they could think about whether these ingredients come from plants or from animals, whether they are natural ingredients or processed. Then I would ask them to go to a supermarket, and this is probably going to be a homework activity, and to try and find out where these ingredients come from. This works best with natural ingredients. So, for example, the tomatoes, probably in the supermarket, it will say where the tomatoes were grown. So I'd have them make a note of this. And then we would work out how far the ingredients have traveled to get to their supermarket using Google Maps, for example. So you can see how we're moving from identifying food, we're working with new vocabulary for food, and then we're finding out about where these foods come from, and then we're exploring distance. So there's quite a lot of language here. There's food vocabulary, there's countries, numbers, transport, maybe cooking vocabulary if you wanted to focus a bit more on the recipe too. And then with older children, I would probably discuss the sustainability aspect too, which takes them a bit further than the initial essential question. So I've designed my tasks. I need to think about the resources and what resources I could bring in for my activities. And there are lots of different types of resources that you could bring into class for the student research. It will depend on the activities. But remember that resources can be in a variety of formats. They can be multimodal. They're not just texts. So again, before I mentioned, 5 minutes left. Oh, I might not have that much time for questions, Elizabeth, sorry. Videos and people as resources too. So you could have them do a class survey, for example, and ask each other questions. Or as I said before, invite guests into your lesson. And finally, you need to think about how you might provide differentiation and scaffolding, because your students are probably quite diverse. They'll have different levels of skills and knowledge in different areas. So you might need to adapt some of the activities. You could maybe you can kind of level the questions that you give students. So different groups are working on different questions, or you can level the activities. And another thing you can do is allow students a choice of formats or different choices. So I'm going to speed up a bit because I'm aware that time is flying. So I did want to mention briefly learner autonomy, because inquiry-based learning is a learner-led approach. And in a perfect world, the students would come up with their own essential questions and work on topics that really interest them. However, that's not really very practical in most educational settings, especially in ELT, because we have specific objectives that we need to cover. And also, it's unlikely to be successful if your students are new to this approach. So what we can do is to provide more learner autonomy in a scaffolded way so that learners gradually develop the skills to take a more central role in guiding the inquiry. So let's look at a few tips. First of all, I would recommend starting off with a whole class inquiry where you do everything as a whole class, or students can still work in groups, but everybody is doing the same activities. You can come up with your questions together, your sub-questions, and then you plan a series of activities and create a lesson sequence. So what I do is I create a plan based on a series of 6 lessons. And this is just an example of how you could structure an inquiry in terms of time and lesson planning. But the timing could also be adapted depending on how engaged your students are. So you don't have to be able to read the text on this slide. They're just images. But the plan includes basic lesson notes, like a simple lesson plan that you could follow for support. And I follow this structure the first few times I do an inquiry with a class. But the aim is always to foster greater autonomy. So let's look at a few more tips. We can start to offer students some choices. So choices about what kind of project they want to make. For example, we might want to give them 3 alternatives to choose from, or they could decide what they want to do in group work, what role they want to take. The next time you do an inquiry, you can give them more options and offer them choice in more of the stages. For example, they could choose the questions they want to explore, encourage them to become a bit more involved in the decision-making process. You could have them bring in resources of their own. They could bring in maybe books that they have at home, or videos that they found, or information that they found from anywhere. And it's okay if this is in Italian, if it's in their L1, that's fine. And we can also encourage them to find out a bit more about it at home, but I would suggest not making it homework. What you could do is share some of the resources with the students' families and just say, look, if you want to, you can have a look at this together at home. So when you and your students are comfortable with this approach and you know what you're doing and you know you've got it all under control, that's when I would suggest maybe planning your own inquiry. But as I said, I think the first few times it's a good idea to structure it very clearly so that you and the students know what you're doing. And then, you know, when you're comfortable, then you can move on. So quick summary, very quick summary. I think I've got 10 minutes left. The steps for the inquiry, for designing your inquiry, are to choose your topic and your language objectives, to come up with an essential question, to develop some guiding questions or sub-questions, to plan some research activities. Remember, these can be all different types of activities, but they need to help students explore maybe one of the sub-questions or several of the sub-questions. Think of some options for products that students could create. And think about the success criteria. I haven't really mentioned this, but it's important to think about what you're expecting students to do and how you're going to evaluate them on the inquiry, because you probably want to evaluate them on lots of different things and not just the language. And also, and this is important, not just evaluating them on the final product. You need to evaluate them on the whole process of the inquiry, not just what they produce at the end. And as I said before, what I've talked about today might seem quite teacher-led, and it is, but I think we need to support students gradually in becoming more independent. Finally, the benefits. For me, it's got a lot of benefits. First of all, the language that we're teaching is based on the students' needs, and we're creating a need for this language by focusing on things that students are interested in and what they want to know and what they want to learn. And for me, this is probably the most important benefit. The language they're learning is real, and they have a real purpose for using it. They're using it to do something. They're not just learning it because it's on the page in their book. And it's based on their needs in terms of language and content. So we can see where the gaps are in their knowledge and focus on the language they need to be able to carry out the different stages of the inquiry. You can tailor it to the learner's interests to some extent. So you can choose topics that interest them and invite them to ask questions about what interests them. You can also adapt the level of the inquiry that different groups do. So it's kind of a flexible way of differentiating. And it's engaging. The learners are fully involved because they're trying to find answers to their own questions. And so they're motivated to find the answers. So designing inquiry isn't so easy if you're new to the approach, and my aim is to help teachers learn about and implement inquiry-based learning in your classrooms. So a couple of ways in which I can do this. So first, I have these resource packs like the ones that you saw in the presentation, and I also developed a training program, a 6-week online program that I ran in June, and the next one I'm planning to run in May 2024. So if you want to find out more information about that, you can check out my website. But before I go, I wanted to share this little gift with you as a thank you for coming, and also to encourage you to try this out in your classroom, to give it a go. So I've got a free mini resource pack for you, which you can get with this QR code. I have a link, but I don't think the chat's working, so I'm not sure where I could share that. Maybe later on I can get it to you somehow. So the topic of this mini pack is gifts. So it's the perfect opportunity to try it out this month before Christmas. It's a mini, oh, the chat is okay. Okay, I'll put it in there in a second. It's a mini resource pack. So this one would just take probably 3 lessons. So if you've got a bit of time at the end of term, why not try it out? So I'm going to check and see if there are any questions. I don't think there are any in the Q&A. If you do have a question, feel free to type it in there now. I'm just going to grab that link so that in case you don't have a QR code reader, let me just, everyone. Okay, the link to the freebie is in the chat. All you do need to do is pop in your email to get it. No questions, Elizabeth. I don't know if anybody wants to ask. Oh, you're muted, Elizabeth. If you do have any other questions that you think of later, feel free to get in touch. This is my email here. Or I'm on all the social networks as well, so just message me with any questions and I can get back to you there too.
No questions, Michelle.
No questions.
Really interesting, really motivating. Thank you so much for that. Yes, people are saying thank you, obviously.
So do you have any questions, Elizabeth?
What challenges do you find in implementing this method? What challenges do you find? What are the main challenges that you find?
Well, there are different challenges depending on whether you're thinking about the teacher or the students. So, for example, if students are not used to working collaboratively in groups, that's very challenging. But I think it's and a lot of teachers are a little bit afraid of doing group work, I notice. And I think part of that is a kind of a mentality, is a mental block,
Yes.
because we want to be in control of everything, and we're not when students are working in groups. Students need training really to do group work successfully, and you can start off with, you know, very short activities in groups, and making sure that the instructions about what they have to do are very clear modeling is really important. And thinking about from the teacher's point of view, in the planning stage, maybe it's difficult to go in without having the language already kind of pre-decided. Sometimes working with emergent language can be difficult as well. But I think that it's worth it. I think you, for this type of approach, you need to, this is why I do it in a very structured way at the beginning, because it's so important to have that structure so that you can try out these different ways of teaching in small steps. So.
Yes, perfect. Great, thank you. Well, it's time to close down, I think. If anyone has any other questions or any comments, just put them in the chat. But I think that's about it. Anyway, yeah, very inspiring, says Julia. And that's what we want, inspiring inquiries.
Yeah, so, exactly.
Yes. Check out Michelle online. She's fab. And she tries to do these inspiring inquiries online. I didn't have time to follow it up. I'm so sorry, because I tried to get involved in an inquiry, but I just didn't have the time. And I think that's a problem with lots of teachers.
Yeah, I forgot to mention our Facebook group. Yeah, so if I'll just mention it very quickly because I've got 1 minute, I think, before we get thrown out. We have a Facebook group where we teacher development through inquiry. So it's called, I haven't got the link handy right now, which I should have done that. But it's not called Inspiring Inquiries. It's called the Teaching Lab Engage Explore. I can't remember the name of it now.
Of course, sorry.
It's called the Teaching Lab. And so if anybody is interested in joining the Facebook group, please do. We'd love to have more teachers, and I don't know if we haven't got many people from Italy in there, so it would be great to have a few Italian teachers in there.
Yeah, that would be nice. Yes, sorry for the name. It's the Teaching Lab, actually. Yeah. So anyway, for inspiring inquiries, join the Teaching Lab, everyone. Okay, on Facebook. Okay, on behalf of TESOL Italy, I want to thank you, Michelle, for your very inspiring talk. Thank you so much. And just remind anyone taking part that the certificates of attendance will be available to download from the convention page of the TESOL Italy website after the convention. So thank you everyone for joining us, and thank you very, very much, Michelle, for your inspiring talk. Thank you. Bye everyone. Thank you.